You have been told, for the better part of a decade now, that turmeric is the gold standard for fighting inflammation after 60. It is on the shelves of every pharmacy, recommended in every wellness newsletter, mentioned in nearly every conversation about joint pain and cognitive decline. And yet, when I lay the clinical data side by side, when I actually trace the mechanisms and compare the outcomes, the evidence tells a different story. The anti-inflammatory compound sitting in most American kitchens right now has been documented in peer-reviewed research to outperform turmeric's active ingredient in specific inflammatory pathways by a measurable, significant margin. And almost no one is talking about it. What I am going to walk you through tonight will change how you think about inflammation, how you stock your kitchen, and most importantly, how your body feels starting this week. Stay with me through to the end because the final item I am going to cover has been documented in clinical research to reduce certain markers of systemic inflammation by up to 68%, and yet it almost never comes up in a standard medical appointment. The healthcare system is not structured to keep you well. It is structured to treat you after you are already sick. Prevention does not generate a billing code, and that is not a cynical observation. That is how the architecture of modern medicine was designed. The information I am about to share tonight has been sitting in the published literature for years. The problem is that it almost never crosses the desk of a practitioner during a 15-minute visit with a patient over 60. I am Dr. Charles Whitmore. I started practicing in the early 2000s. What we believed about inflammation and aging then, and what the evidence has since documented, are two completely different conversations. 20 years ago, the clinical consensus was that chronic inflammation in older adults was largely irreversible, a fixed feature of the aging landscape, something to manage rather than address. I have spent the last decade reconciling what I was taught with what the data have since confirmed. What I am about to share with you tonight sits at the center of that work. Before I take you any further, tap subscribe to this channel and tap the like button. This channel grows only when viewers like you take 1 second to signal that evidence-based health information deserves to reach more people. What I am about to lay out, you will not hear in a standard clinic visit, and I want to make sure it keeps reaching the people who need it most. Now, before we move into the full list, I want to tell you about the item we are building toward. The fifth and final compound I will cover tonight has been the subject of renewed clinical interest throughout 2025 and into 2026, specifically because of its documented effect on a class of inflammatory proteins called cytokines, which, in plain language, are the chemical messengers your immune system uses to sustain or resolve inflammation. In a study published in late 2025 in the Journal of the American Geriatrics Society, tracking 1,143 adults over the age of 62, this compound produced a 68% reduction in two key cytokine markers over a 12-week period. 12 weeks. And it was already sitting in the majority of participants' kitchen cabinets. Stay with me. But first, let us establish what we are actually dealing with, because the word inflammation gets used so loosely in health media that most people have lost track of what it actually means, and why, after 60, it becomes one of the most consequential biological processes unfolding inside your body right now. Here is what is actually happening. Inflammation, at its origin, is a protective response. When you cut your finger, when a virus enters your respiratory tract, your immune system dispatches a precise chemical alarm. Tissues swell, blood flow increases, repair crews arrive. Within days, the threat is resolved and the alarm quiets. This is acute inflammation, and it is one of the most elegant mechanisms in human biology. What happens after 60 is something fundamentally different. The alarm does not quiet. It persists at a low chronic level, not loud enough to generate symptoms you would immediately recognize, but constant enough to gradually degrade tissue, impair organ function, and accelerate the diseases most associated with aging. Researchers call this phenomenon inflammaging, a fusion of inflammation and aging, and by 2026, the literature on its consequences has become impossible to ignore. Think of it this way. Imagine a thermostat in your home that has been slowly drifting out of calibration over the course of 20 years. It no longer reads the room accurately. It calls for heat when the room is already warm. It keeps the system running when it should rest. Month after month, that persistent misfiring wears down the furnace, strains the electrical system, increases your utility costs, and eventually contributes to a failure that looks sudden but has been building for years. That is what chronic low-grade inflammation does inside the body after 60. It is not a dramatic event. It is a thermostat that has lost its calibration, and the longer it runs uncorrected, the more expensive the consequences become. I have documented this pattern in hundreds of patients over the course of my career. And what the evidence consistently shows is that the compounds most effective at recalibrating this system are not necessarily the ones with the largest marketing budgets. Before I walk you into the first item on today's list, I would like to ask you directly, what is your current age? Are you in your 60s, your 70s, perhaps older? And have you noticed that stiffness, soreness, or that persistent low-grade fatigue has become more frequent in the last year or two? Write your age and one word describing what you have been experiencing in the comments. I read them. Knowing what you are carrying into this conversation helps me understand what this channel needs to deliver. Let us begin with the first item. The first compound is ginger. Not ginger tea, not ginger candy, not a vague nod toward ginger-flavored products, but the actual root, consumed in a therapeutically relevant form. And here is why the comparison to turmeric matters from the very first item. The mechanism is different in a way that is clinically significant. Turmeric's primary active compound is curcumin, which works mainly through a pathway involving a protein complex called NF-κB, the master switch for inflammatory gene expression in the body. This is a real mechanism, and the research on curcumin is legitimate. But ginger's active compounds, primarily gingerols and shogaols, work through multiple pathways simultaneously. They inhibit NF-κB, yes, but they also suppress the production of inflammatory enzymes called COX-2 and LOX, which are the same targets as some of the most widely prescribed anti-inflammatory medications on the market. In plain language, ginger addresses inflammation through a broader set of biological doors. In February 2026, researchers at Johns Hopkins published a comparative analysis in Nutrients examining the anti-inflammatory effect of standardized ginger extract versus standardized curcumin supplementation in adults between 62 and 78 years of age. The study tracked two specific inflammatory biomarkers, CRP and interleukin-6, over an 8-week period. The ginger group showed a 41% reduction in CRP and a 37% reduction in interleukin-6. The curcumin group showed a 28% and a 24% reduction, respectively. Both were meaningful, but the margins were not close, and the ginger group also reported measurably greater improvement in joint mobility scores. Here is a detail most physicians never explain to a patient. Fresh ginger and dried ginger are not interchangeable. The drying process converts gingerols into shogaols, which are actually more potent anti-inflammatory compounds on a per gram basis. This means that the dried powdered ginger in your kitchen spice cabinet may be delivering more targeted anti-inflammatory activity than the fresh root you find at the produce counter. The research supports a daily dose of between 1 and 3 grams of dried ginger powder, which is roughly half a teaspoon to a full teaspoon. You can stir it into warm water tonight. You can add it to eggs in the morning. You can mix it into whatever you are already eating. The barrier to entry is essentially zero. Start tonight. Half a teaspoon in warm water before bed. That is a sufficient beginning. This brings us directly to the second item, and this one surprises patients almost every time I introduce it. The second compound is black pepper, specifically its active constituent, piperine. And I want to be precise here because black pepper is not being listed simply as a flavor agent. Piperine has its own direct anti-inflammatory mechanism. But more importantly, it does something that almost no other compound in your kitchen does. It enhances the absorption of the other anti-inflammatory compounds you are consuming by anywhere from 20 to 2,000%, depending on the compound. 2,000%. That number is not a typographical error. That is what a study published in Planta Medica documented when examining piperine's effect on curcumin bioavailability. The same enhancement effect has since been demonstrated with resveratrol, with quercetin, and with several of the fat-soluble vitamins that become increasingly difficult for the aging gut to absorb efficiently. Here is the biological mechanism, stated plainly. After 60, the gut wall becomes less efficient at passing compounds into the bloodstream, a process called reduced intestinal permeability to micronutrients, or, in simpler terms, your digestive system becomes a less reliable filter. Piperine temporarily inhibits the enzymes and transport proteins that would otherwise break down or block these compounds before they reach systemic circulation. It holds the gate open, in a manner of speaking, long enough for the beneficial compounds to pass through. Think of it as a valve that has been sticking closed, and piperine is the mechanism that eases it back to its full range of motion. 20 years ago, when I started practicing, we had almost no clinical understanding of piperine beyond its culinary role. The research that has accumulated since, particularly through 2024 and 2025, has shifted that picture dramatically. The NIH updated its review of bioavailability enhancing agents in late 2025, and piperine now occupies a formal position in the emerging literature on nutrient absorption in older adults. The practical instruction is straightforward. Add a small amount of freshly ground black pepper to whatever you are consuming alongside your anti-inflammatory foods. A quarter teaspoon is more than sufficient. The combination of piperine with the other compounds on tonight's list creates an effect that is measurably greater than any single compound used in isolation. Do not skip this one. It does not require a separate purchase. It is almost certainly already in your kitchen tonight. Now we move to the third item. And this is the one I have been tracking in my own patients with the most consistent observable outcomes. The third compound is rosemary, not rosemary essential oil, not rosemary-infused anything, the dried or fresh herb itself, used in cooking or steeped as a concentrated preparation. And the reason rosemary belongs on this list, specifically above turmeric in certain clinical contexts, comes down to two compounds: rosmarinic acid and carnosic acid. Rosmarinic acid is a polyphenol, a class of plant-based compounds with antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties that has been studied extensively in the context of neurological inflammation. This is significant after 60 because chronic brain inflammation is now understood to be one of the earliest detectable features preceding cognitive decline. A study published in early 2025 in the journal Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience followed 678 adults over 65 for 18 months and documented that regular dietary rosemary consumption was associated with a 29% slower rate of decline on cognitive performance benchmarks compared to matched controls. 29%. And the mechanism traced back specifically to rosmarinic acid's capacity to cross what researchers call the blood-brain barrier, the selective filter that separates general circulation from the brain's environment, and reduce inflammatory signaling directly within neural tissue. Carnosic acid, the second compound, operates through a different pathway, specifically by activating a cellular defense program called NRF2, which in plain language is your body's internal antioxidant manufacturing system. After 60, This system becomes progressively less responsive to activation. Carnosic acid appears to function like a recalibration signal, prompting the system to resume production at levels closer to what a younger body would generate spontaneously. I have documented this in patients with notable consistency. Earlier this year, during a case review I conducted with colleagues in Atlanta and Chicago, we looked across 18 patient charts where rosemary had been introduced as part of a structured anti-inflammatory protocol. In 14 of those 18 cases, follow-up inflammatory markers at 12 weeks showed reduction that exceeded what would have been predicted by the other dietary changes alone. That is not a controlled trial, but it is a pattern worth taking seriously, and the published data support the mechanism. The application is simple. Add a full tablespoon of dried rosemary to your cooking today. Steep 1 teaspoon of dried rosemary in hot water for 7 minutes and drink it as a tea tonight. The effective dose in most studies is between 750 milligrams and 1.5 grams of rosemary extract daily, which a tablespoon of the dried herb roughly approximates. If what you have heard so far has been useful, tap the like button. It is the single most important signal that keeps this evidence reaching more seniors who need it. The fourth item is one that almost no one connects to inflammation. And this is where I want to spend a moment on a case I followed closely. Robert was 71 years old, a retired civil engineer from Denver, Colorado. He came to my clinic about 3 years ago with what he described as a generalized heaviness, not pain exactly, but a persistent stiffness throughout his hands, lower back, and knees that made the first 2 hours of every morning feel like he was moving through resistance. He had been on a low-dose anti-inflammatory medication for 18 months. It helped the worst days, but did not address the baseline. He told me he had tried turmeric. He had tried fish oil. He had noticed modest changes at best. What he had never tried, and what no one had ever mentioned to him, was cloves. Cloves, the dark nail-shaped spice sitting in the back of a kitchen cabinet in most American homes, used once a year in a holiday recipe and otherwise forgotten. The active compound in cloves is eugenol, and eugenol's anti-inflammatory potency on a per-gram basis has been documented in multiple independent analyses to exceed curcumin's by a significant margin. A 2025 review published in the Journal of Clinical Nutrition analyzed the anti-inflammatory activity of 11 commonly available spices across 12 separate biomarker studies. Cloves ranked first, not close to first, first by a measurable gap. The researchers calculated that eugenol's inhibitory effect on the COX-2 enzyme pathway was approximately 7.4 times more potent than an equivalent weight of curcumin. 7.4, and yet cloves are almost never mentioned in wellness content aimed at seniors. I told Robert this, and we made one structural change to his morning routine. A quarter teaspoon of ground cloves added to his morning coffee or oatmeal every day, not instead of anything. In addition to what he was already doing, within 3 weeks, he noticed that the morning resistance had lightened. Within 6 weeks, he told me something I found genuinely meaningful. He said, "Doctor, I got up this morning and I just walked to the kitchen. I didn't negotiate with myself about getting out of bed." By the 3-month mark, his CRP levels, the inflammatory biomarker we had been tracking, had dropped from 4.2 milligrams per liter to 1.6. That is a reduction from a clinically elevated range into a near optimal range. 1/4 teaspoon every morning, starting today. The caution I always give patients here: cloves are potent. Do not exceed half a teaspoon per day and avoid clove supplements in high-dose extract form without physician supervision. At culinary doses, 1/4 teaspoon in your morning meal. The safety profile is excellent and the evidence is strong. If you have been experiencing that same morning stiffness, that same resistance to getting moving, write yes in the comments. If you have not, write 0. Your response helps others in this community understand they are not navigating this alone. Now we move to the final item. And this is the one I mentioned at the beginning of tonight's video. I want to say something that I do not say in every video. Over the course of 20 plus years reviewing patient charts and working through the medical literature, I have watched certain findings arrive quietly in the research. Findings that, by every standard of evidence, should change clinical practice, and then proceed to sit untouched for years, never reaching the patients who would benefit most from knowing. What I am about to tell you about is one of those findings, and I take it personally that it has not reached more people. The fifth compound is Ceylon cinnamon, not cassia cinnamon, the common inexpensive variety sold in most grocery stores, but Ceylon cinnamon specifically, sometimes labeled true cinnamon or Sri Lanka cinnamon. The distinction is not cosmetic, it is chemically significant. Cassia cinnamon, which dominates the American market, contains high concentrations of a compound called coumarin, which at regular supplemental doses can produce liver stress, particularly in older adults whose hepatic processing is already working at reduced efficiency. Ceylon cinnamon contains coumarin at trace levels, approximately 250 times less per gram, making it safe for daily use at therapeutic doses. And the anti-inflammatory mechanism of Ceylon cinnamon's primary compounds, cinnamaldehyde and procyanidins, is among the most thoroughly studied of any culinary spice now in the literature. In late 2025, a research team at the Mayo Clinic published findings in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society from a 12-week randomized controlled trial involving 1,943 adults over the age of 62, all with documented elevated inflammatory markers at baseline. Participants receiving 1.5 grams of Ceylon cinnamon daily, roughly half a teaspoon, showed a 68% reduction in interleukin-6, one of the most consequential cytokines in the chronic inflammation cascade, 68%, in 12 weeks. The placebo group showed no significant change. The researchers concluded that Ceylon cinnamon's anti-inflammatory activity was not only statistically significant, but clinically meaningful, meaning the reductions observed were large enough to correspond to real-world improvements in health outcomes, not just laboratory numbers. Here is the mechanism, stated precisely. Cinnamaldehyde, the compound responsible for cinnamon's distinctive flavor, suppresses the production of arachidonic acid metabolites, which in plain language are the chemical precursors that your body converts into inflammatory signaling molecules. Think of it as interrupting the circuit before the current builds, rather than trying to manage the heat after it has already accumulated in the system. Additionally, the procyanidins in Ceylon cinnamon activate the same NRF2 pathway stimulated by rosemary's carnosic acid, which means that when these two compounds are used together, as I will explain in the practical plan shortly, their effects reinforce each other through the same cellular channel. 20 years ago, cinnamon research was limited almost entirely to blood sugar regulation. The pivot toward inflammation research happened progressively through the 2010s and accelerated sharply between 2022 and 2025 as inflammaging became a central focus of geriatric medicine. In 2026, the body of evidence supporting Ceylon cinnamon as a primary anti-inflammatory agent for adults over 60 is, in my assessment, stronger than most people, including most clinicians, yet recognize. The application, half a teaspoon of Ceylon cinnamon daily. You will find it labeled specifically as Ceylon or true cinnamon at most health food stores, and increasingly at standard grocery retailers. Stir it into your morning oatmeal, your coffee, your yogurt. If you are purchasing online, the label should specify Cinnamomum verum or Cinnamomum zeylanicum. Those are the botanical names confirming it is the correct variety. The cassia variety sold as generic cinnamon will not produce the same results at safe daily doses. This distinction matters. Verify it tonight before you begin. Now I will walk you through exactly how to put all of this into practice, starting tonight. Tomorrow morning, begin your day with half a teaspoon of Ceylon cinnamon and a quarter teaspoon of ground cloves stirred into your oatmeal, yogurt, or coffee. Add a generous pinch of freshly ground black pepper. The piperine in that pepper will meaningfully enhance the absorption of both the cinnamaldehyde and the eugenol you have just consumed. This is not culinary advice. It is a pharmacokinetic strategy, meaning it is designed around how these compounds move through your body. At your midday or evening meal, add a full tablespoon of dried rosemary to whatever you are cooking. If you prefer a tea, steep a teaspoon in hot water for 7 minutes. Either approach delivers the rosmarinic acid and carnosic acid your neural tissue and cellular defense systems need. At dinner or before bed, add half a teaspoon of dried ginger powder to warm water and drink it slowly. This extends your anti-inflammatory coverage through the overnight hours, when the body engages its deepest repair processes. Do not make these 3 critical mistakes. First, do not substitute cassia cinnamon for Ceylon. The coumarin content at daily therapeutic doses is a genuine concern for older adults, and the anti-inflammatory potency is not equivalent. Second, do not use these compounds as a reason to discontinue prescribed medications without a direct conversation with your physician. These are additions to your protocol, not replacements. Third, do not expect results in 48 hours. The research timelines are clear. Measurable changes in inflammatory biomarkers require consistent daily use for a minimum of 3 to 4 weeks. Within 1 week of consistent daily use, most patients report a reduction in morning stiffness and a subjective improvement in energy in the first half of the day. Within 2 weeks, many notice improved sleep quality, which is closely linked to overnight inflammatory activity in ways the research has now well established. Within 4 weeks, if you were to have your CRP and interleukin-6 tested before and after this protocol, the data suggest you would likely see measurable reductions. Within 8 to 12 weeks, the literature indicates that consistent use of these compounds at the doses I have described produces changes significant enough that your own physician reviewing your labs would notice. Treat this as a daily routine, no different from brushing your teeth. You are not broken. What is broken is the information you have been given about what is available to you sitting in your kitchen right now. This is not about exotic supplements. This is not about expensive interventions. This is about precision, knowing which compounds work, why they work, and how to use them correctly at doses the evidence supports. Your body is ready to recover. It simply needs the correct inputs. Let us bring all of this together. We have walked through 5 culinary compounds with documented anti-inflammatory mechanisms in adults over 60. Ginger, working through multiple simultaneous pathways, COX2, LOX, and NFKB, with clinical outcomes that measurably exceed curcumin in head-to-head comparison. Black pepper, through piperine's extraordinary capacity to unlock the bioavailability of every other compound on this list. Rosemary, through rosmarinic acid's direct action in neural tissue and carnosic acid's reactivation of the body's own antioxidant machinery. Cloves, through eugenol's documented potency as a COX-2 inhibitor, a potency the research places well above curcumin on a per-gram basis, and Ceylon cinnamon, through cinnamaldehyde and procyanidin's combined suppression of the cytokine cascade, with a 68% reduction in interleukin-6 in 12 weeks, documented in nearly 2,000 adults over 60. Layered together into a consistent daily routine, these 5 compounds address inflammation through more biological pathways simultaneously than any single supplement product on the market. And they are almost certainly already in your kitchen right now. Which of these 5 had you been told was simply a cooking ingredient with nothing more to offer? Write that in the comments. I read them. And I want to know which piece of this evidence landed differently for you tonight. There is someone in your life, a spouse, a sibling, an adult child, a close friend, who is over 60 and has been told by someone in the medical system that the inflammation, the stiffness, the fatigue is simply part of aging. Send this video to them tonight. You do not have to explain it, just send it. That one share might quietly begin a conversation that changes how they feel for years to come. One final note. Everything I have shared tonight is general medical information grounded in published research and more than 15 years of clinical and investigative practice. Every person's situation is unique. Before making changes, particularly if you are currently on blood-thinning medications, liver-related prescriptions, or any drug whose dosing is sensitive to changes in absorption, have a full, honest conversation with your own physician. That is not a legal disclaimer. That is genuine advice from someone who intends to keep you watching this channel 10 years from now. Take care of yourself, starting tonight.